Welcome to the definitive guide to the impact of iOS 14 and your Facebook ad data. We're going to debunk a whole lot of myths and misunderstanding around this thing that honestly should have been a speed bump for you last summer. And we're going to help you also understand what data Facebook does have, how an optimized CPM platform works, which actually debunks most of the fear, and ultimately big mistakes to avoid. So stick around. This is going to be super awesome. Also, before we get started, I just want to say thank you very much. I know you could be anywhere on the internet right now, and you've chosen to be here. Do not be shy to hit subscribe, to hit like, share this with your friend. And if you want more advice, go to links.facebookdisruptor.com. There are plenty more resources there. Podcasts, find me on social, ways to sign up for webinars, ebooks, and more resources for you to make sure that 2022 is your best year ever and that you see more success and less stress with your ads every day moving forward from now. Let's get started. So, first off, let's identify very clearly what data Facebook still has after iOS 14. Well, do we legitimately think that the iOS 14 operating system update prevents Facebook from seeing what you do on the Facebook app? Does it somehow cloud the user history data from your last 10 or 15 years on the platform? Does iOS 14 impair Facebook's ability to use your credit card data and tax information that it's had going back a decade? Does iOS 14 block Facebook from being able to understand who you're messaging, what pages you're engaging with, what videos you're interacting with, who you are commenting on, and ultimately what kind of content you are receiving in a positive way that's giving you a high estimated action rate to keep you coming back from the platform? Have you noticed that when you've engaged with content, you are in no way ever seeing anything like what you've been previously engaged with ever again? Because where I'm sitting, none of those things are true. And really this comes down to what data does Facebook still have? And what is the real impact of iOS 14? Well, I'm going to debunk this right up front and then we can get deeper. So first off, iOS 14's number one impact on advertising inside of Facebook was simply that it made not following best practices more harmful than it was already. If you are relying on interest groups, there's less data to support the thing that Facebook stopped supporting years ago. If you're using lookalike audiences, there's less data for Facebook to be able to use to populate an audience that you probably don't need anyway. If you're using retargeting audiences, well, they say they're getting smaller, but really what it means is you're not being included in audiences if you take the next step that you've organized in your aggregated events manager. Basically, retargeting has exclusions already built in. So the real question is, what information does Facebook not have versus what aren't they legally allowed to show you in real time? And that's really where the question gets down to. And you're going to see a big discrepancy between Facebook and third-party reporting platforms like Triple Whale and Northbeam, etc. And that doesn't mean that those avenues, those alternative solutions to tracking results are wrong. It just means that the inference that Facebook can't see this information is actually incorrect. Have you noticed on Facebook that the total number of events all of a sudden doesn't match? I'm not saying the number of conversions. I'm saying the number of viewed contents, add to carts, purchase volume. Have you seen a dramatic discrepancy around the data that Facebook is collecting because of pixel events that are firing on your web page? Or is the real issue in that lie in that the UI that you're used to engaging with on a regular basis isn't showing you all of the data that you're used to seeing? Back when you thought Facebook took too much credit, now that it's showing you a more realistic and potentially interpretation of what's going on, by redefining how the math works and the information you're exposed to, it's now not getting enough credit. At some point, we have to stop worrying about attribution and credit Because as soon as we give up that lie, because remember, attribution is complete nonsense. As soon as we give up the idea that we can legitimately control an impression by user, by auction, to force the one ad onto the one person that's going to make them buy, because everybody exists in a vacuum. Nobody's ever shown an ad a second time. First impression ratio actually matters. Retargeting actually is important. When we begin to throw out all of that stuff that has been objectively proven wrong by every empirical data set you could possibly look at, other than your own information preset by misunderstandings of the platform and not you setting it up properly, well, then we don't worry about any of that stuff anymore. At the end of the day, Facebook is an optimized CPM environment. You are getting delivery on ads that meets Facebook's business objective. And we're going to get to that here in just a little bit of how the optimized CPM environment works. Because remember, Facebook invented this new way of showing content to monetize eyeballs for profit. They were incredibly disruptive in that environment, and really nobody's been able to topple them. Other platforms have tried to do it in other ways, and right now we're seeing TikTok be the single most aggressive alternative to discovery of content. But ultimately, nobody has a decades-long warehouse of consumer behavior with literally billions of users and untold trillions of data points to determine what to show you. Ultimately, spend is a meritocracy. And the less control you try to exhibit over the machine, the greater the machine can do the work that you're training it to get done. Now, ultimately, if this doesn't work out well for you, it has way more to do with your teaching of the platform. Basically, you've poorly trained an employee, and then you're holding them accountable for not being good at their job without you micromanaging them. Now, I don't know about you, but if I've definitely had bosses that micromanaged every move I made. And I can pretty much categorically tell you that I was terrible at my job when they did that it wasn't a good fit, and that ultimately that boss was way more stressed out and unable to do the rest of their work because they didn't set me up for success. Now, you might be sitting there saying, well, Facebook is still working for me. I don't do any of the things that you talk about, and it's still working. Let me ask you this. Is your definition of success a good one? Is your definition of success, we're maintaining a ROAS on our business and we're still able to be in business? That's not success. I mean, survival is good, sure. But are you consistently growing the business at a projectable rate that makes you attractive for investment or exit? Or are you treading water trying to figure out a way to take more credit for more work to inflate vanity metrics and aren't growing the business in any meaningful way? Are you making 2, 3, 5% change decisions? Or are you making 100, 200, 300% change decisions? Ultimately, this comes down to one simple fact. iOS14, in masking user behavior, ultimately only impacts a small fraction of the very end of the customer journey, and it really only masks that to the advertiser. And that's something we have to understand. There is not this giant cloak where Facebook doesn't see that a transaction occurred. And ultimately, even if that were true, if you're using any electronic form of payment to buy things through a Facebook ad, which if you're not using electronic payment to buy things on the internet, we can have a whole other conversation. Do we not think that that information is getting passed? Has Facebook not used credit card data and tax information for over a decade? Because where I'm sitting, that's been happening for longer than you've been on the platform. So if we know that ultimately Facebook understands what you're spending your time on, what you're engaging with, what things you actually care about, what conversations you're having, who you're having them with, what sites you've been to over the last decade or more, where you're spending your money, what you're spending your money on, and how frequently you're spending on specific things, and when you're doing it in a way that you can understand pretty accurately who you are as a customer persona, your buying behavior, how, and ultimately how to condition you to take a specific action? Is that not good enough? Because iOS 14 is not blocking any of that information. So ultimately, we're coming down to a conversation of what data does Facebook already have? And from where I'm sitting, Facebook has way more than it needs to deliver you a consistent result if you use it properly. And ultimately, your other alternative is to use a dumber machine with less data, with less users, with less market share, with less options on creative type, with less user experiences on less devices across fewer platforms. If your path is to try to root that out, when you fail, it won't be Facebook's fault.